Demonstrations up to this point have shown basic usage of ZZT Sound Plus. This video covers more advanced material. The steps identified in this video will walk you through the process of artifact removal. The term artifact refers to a shorter, quieter note that does not resemble the note within the staff you wish to keep. Artifacts appear for two reasons: the fact that most instruments do not generate perfect sine waves when played, and because percussion tends to drop random noise into the frequency distribution. There are ways of telling a legitimate note from an artifact. ZZT Sound Plus provides several tools to aid you. We once again take a look at the song Spelunker. This time, we are going to select notes more carefully, as well as examine the gauges located above the timeline. With the tempo set correctly, the next most helpful settings are the time and key signatures. The time signature is set to 4/4 by default. This is correct for Spelunker. Most songs have 4/4, so we don't need to do anything else here. Right-click and choose the option to select the whole measure at once. In the upper left of the timeline, we have the chord gauge. This readout measures energy spectral density of the selection. Energy spectral density is the sum of products of the duration-volume pairs of all selected notes. If notes for multiple octaves are present for a single half step in the musical scale, notes are summed at all octaves. The general idea behind the chord gauge is that notes with greater energy stand out, measuring higher, while artifacts are more scattered and measure lower. We can see the key E stand out more than any other. This tells us that the key signature is in all likelihood either E major or E minor. Subjectively, we know this is a minor key, so E minor it is. We now set the key signature in the global settings. This makes it easier to identify notes at the scale in question. While the first note in the first measure does not necessarily need to begin with the song's actual key, this is usually true of most songs. If this does not apply to the song you wish to model, you may need to select a different measure or combination of notes in order to find this information. The beginning of the song is quite simple. It contains only whole notes, half notes, and quarter notes. We first set the active update info to quarter note duration. Next, we right-click parts of the measure and select the active duration interval. This gathers a selection of quarter note durations with starting points rounded to each measure. We see the E as the most prominent note. The actual sequence is E half note followed by 2 E quarter notes, 1 octave higher. But with all these artifacts, you might not necessarily know this without performing a lot of editing, testing, playing back, and other staff modifying operations. Fortunately, artifacts are removed easily by deselecting notes from the chord gauge. We click E within the chord gauge to remove those E notes from our selection. Now, we delete the notes. We just deleted every key in our selection except for the E notes. Now, the display is much cleaner. There is still the need to clean up the durations of the notes. This will be discussed in a future video. But for the time being, most of the difficult work for this measure is finished. We know exactly which notes to focus on during the editing process. Even with the chord gauge, though, instruments will demonstrate a phenomenon that was not addressed earlier. This phenomenon is known as instrument aliasing. When an instrument is played, the waveform often contains quieter harmonics that show up in the octaves above or below the note. Under normal circumstances, an individual would be expected to play only one note at a key. Multiple octaves simultaneous playback is possible with some instruments, such as a piano, but less likely. Aliased notes can be identified as quieter from the main frequency we are trying to represent. The numbers to the right of each note identify a logarithmic volume measurement. The higher the number, the louder the note. The volume show minimum in the lower left helps to limit which notes are displayed on the staff. We eliminated many of them from view by selecting a reasonable limit, which is close to -20 decibels. For perspective, here is what the staff looks like if we turn the limit down to nothing. As we can see, a lower limit means more artifacts, and a higher limit means less. Depending on how much nuance of a song you wish to capture, you should set this appropriately. If this is set reasonably, it will save you a lot of time in removing artifacts. The other show hide setting of interest in this part of the window is the F number show range. The high frequency part of the musical scale often has the most artifacts. It makes sense to reduce the maximum shown frequency to a reasonable level. In this case, we have completely removed octave 2 and octave 7 from consideration. The fact that high-frequency artifacts are captured often gives the playback a tinny feel to it. This makes them relatively easy to identify when the notes are played back. Unfortunately, there is no consistent strategy when figuring out, beyond any reasonable doubt, which notes are legitimate and which notes are artifacts. While these tips have hopefully provided some help, it is the discretion of the user to identify and remove artifacts. My name is Christopher Allen, and I approve this message.